All right, so welcome to our workshop, Using Student Achievement and Feedback to Improve Your Teaching. Student achievement and feedback should inform our teaching practices. Immediate instructional adjustments can be based on several assessment techniques, including formal assessments or student self-assessment or classroom assessment. After we gather data or evidence on our students' learning, we can then analyze that evidence to determine whether students are on track to meet learning outcomes, and if not, we can figure out how to change our teaching strategies and approaches to enhance our students' learning. So in this workshop, we'll be discussing how and when to assess student learning to determine when to make changes to instructional approaches and to decide what kinds of changes will be the most effective. I will be your presenter today. My name is Amanda Smothers. I'm the Teaching and Learning Coordinator in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. I've been in my current role in CITL for almost 4 years, and I've been teaching college composition and literature for almost 15 years. All right, so let's get to know you all. In the text chat, tell us what your department or your division is, what's your role, and also explain what you hope to get out of this workshop. And if you'd rather, oh, there you go. All right, so we've got Chris, CanPE, wants to understand better how to apply student feedback to the development of future courses. Great. We will definitely talk about that. All right, and as you are adding that information to the chat, if you're still working on that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So keep working on that. But also, something that I like to do with my online students when we're in a synchronous session is to kind of gauge where they're at with just an emoji in the chat. It's an easy way for students to start engaging at the beginning of the class session without having to put forth a lot of emotional or mental bandwidth. And it also gives me information about where my students are at, where their headspace is at, where they're at emotionally, and take that into consideration as we move along in the class session. So you can go through and click that emoji icon there in the chat and then share an emoji for how you're doing today. Got a little sniffles today for my allergies. Carol, thank you. Accountancy wants to see different ways to inspire students' engagement in coursework. Great. And Zach, physical education, Let's look at enhancing feedback for students. Excellent. All right, so let us, love the emojis. Let's move on to our next slide here, and we'll talk about first assessment standards. So grading practices vary from discipline to discipline. They vary between course levels. They even can vary among departments or institutions, or even between individual instructors teaching the exact same course. So some common strategies for successful grading across the board include creating clear grading criteria so students know, what exactly they're being graded on, and then communicating that grading criteria to students so that they're very clear about that, providing constructive feedback to students, and using effective time management strategies when we're grading. So in other words, we want to get our students that feedback as soon as possible so that they can apply that to their learning and make improvements going forward. So the first step in effective grading is establishing those assessment standards. What do we want to accomplish? We want to accomplish, explaining our assessment standards clearly when we introduce the course to our students. And then we also want to remind them of those standards throughout the semester so that they're very clear about what our expectations are. Also, communicating clear grading standards is going to help students figure out what to focus on for their course learning. It's also an opportunity for us to communicate to students what's most important for them to learn in our class, and we want to remain consistent with grading policies like late work or extra time on exams, and then communicate those policies to students as well. And that might be especially important now as we're kind of moving out of pandemic teaching into endemic teaching, and students are getting used to our standards shifting perhaps away from maybe more permissive standards during the pandemic to account for students' challenges, maybe into more of our traditional standards moving out of the pandemic and into the endemic. So having those standards be clear and having that communicated to students and remaining consistent with that will help them get used to that shift. Another important aspect of assessment so that we can use it to improve our teaching is keeping thorough and accurate records of student performance evaluations throughout the semester. So we want to keep detailed records to help us ensure that we're being consistent in our grading throughout the semester. And it's also going to allow us to look back on our students' achievement to determine where we might need to make adjustments to our teaching so we can improve student learning and outcomes. And if we're not keeping those detailed records, then we don't have that data to analyze and then to act upon. So if we keep detailed records and we keep our records up to date, even just through the Blackboard gradebook, that gives our students information about their own progress, but it also gives us a lot of information about our students and where we might need to improve our own teaching practice to improve student achievement and outcomes. So keeping detailed records can help us respond to student concerns about their grade performance, for one, but it'll also help us see patterns in student achievement and identify specific problem areas so that we can address them. If there's a content area, for example, that a lot of students are having difficulty with, we could use that data to inform our teaching practices and adjust those teaching practices. Maybe we need to revisit that information or go slower with that information. Seeing this information when there is actually time to make changes for our current students is important for student learning and success. So we want to be looking at these patterns of student achievement throughout the semester. But we can also look at the data retrospectively as we plan for the next semester of teaching and look for ways to improve our teaching practice for the next round of students. So it's kind of twofold in that way. We want to improve the learning for our students that we have right now, and then also further improve the learning for our students in the future. We can also provide students with explicit instruction on using their own achievement data to monitor their own performance and establish their own goals for learning. This kind of data analysis process can motivate students. It can help them plan out accomplishments that are attainable, reveal their learning outcomes, and provide students with a sense of control over their own learning goals. And then we can use these goals to better understand maybe what may motivate individual students' performance and adjust our instructional practices accordingly. To help students learn from their achievement data, we need to provide that data to our students, first of all, and it also needs to be in a user-friendly format. And we also need to explain to students what our learning objectives are, so that they can see, make use of that data and understand it. One tool that could help with this process is a rubric that outlines our learning objectives clearly and presents student data in a descriptive format to show students their achievement strengths and areas for improvement. And then providing students with this data isn't enough on its own. We need to have them actually do something with it. That's where that goal setting that I mentioned comes into play. You could have them set goals, learning goals based on their data in a variety of ways. One way that I do this is through written reflections throughout the semester. So a learning journal or learning reflections. And then you can have them, as you build upon these throughout the semester, you can have them look back at, their previous reflections or their previous goals and determine whether they've met those goals, why they think they have or haven't, and then use that to inform their goals moving forward. Another way to get feedback on student achievement is through small group instructional diagnoses, or SGIDs. So a small group instructional diagnosis is a midterm course evaluation method, or it could actually be done at any point in the term, but it uses an outside facilitator to hold a discussion with students and to provide feedback to an instructor. So SGIDs can help strengthen communication between faculty and students. It can offer an opportunity to make course adjustments. It can also assist in the development of ideas for strengthening a course. So a little bit of background information on small group instructional diagnosis from the University of Northern Iowa Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning says the small group instructional diagnosis was developed by Joseph Clark and Mark Redmond as a government grant project in 1982. And the SGID is a midterm course evaluation where a trained facilitator conducts a structured conversation with students to highlight the students' consensus on what's going well and poorly in the class, what the instructor could do to further facilitate students' learning, and what students could do to contribute to their own learning. So it's also, involving them in the responsibility for their own learning in that way. So some reasons to use this method of feedback or something similar to it include maybe wanting to acquire more detailed feedback on students' learning experience, to get feedback that represents the student group attitude toward the course. So, with this method, they come to some sort of consensus in their small groups, to find out what we could change to improve student learning in and satisfaction with our course, to actually make those changes, to enhance our teaching efficacy, and to gather formative feedback that isn't part of the tenure and promotion or reappointment process. So it's lower pressure feedback that's really just meant to help us improve our teaching practice without worrying about those other things being formally evaluated. In her book, Student Ratings of Instruction, Recognizing Effective Teaching, which is published in 2013, Neera Hativa reports that Cohen in 1980 performed a meta-analysis of 17 studies that examined the effects of midterm evaluation on improving teaching, and he found that receiving feedback from student ratings administered during the first half of the term was positively related to improving teaching as measured by students' ratings at the end of the term. And then similarly, another researcher, Murray, showed that midterm feedback with ratings of specific behaviors led to significant improvement of classroom teaching as indicated by significantly higher ratings of overall teaching at the end of the term. And then Murray also concluded that under the right conditions, midterm feedback on specific teaching behaviors could significantly improve teaching. So this type of small group feedback session generally involves the use of small group discussions with students that cover the strengths of the course and what changes students think would help support their learning. One way that you could work this type of feedback session into your classes would be to have someone who will serve as that outside consultant come to your class early in the semester. And this could be, we actually do this in CITL. We can serve as that outside consultant for you and set that up. So it's, kind of a process. But if you're interested in that, definitely contact us. So you have someone who will serve as that outside consultant come into your class early in the semester, arrive at the beginning of the class session, and observe the class session until there's maybe 25-30 minutes left in the session, depending on how long your class session is. And then you'd turn the class over to that observer and you would leave the room. And the observer would then explain the purpose of the small group session, how it will be conducted, and then they divide the class into small groups with, a pre-established questionnaire that the students would then answer within that group, and they would have to, within the group, come to consensus on their answers. And then, you could take that a step further. There could be a wider class discussion based on what was discussed in the smaller groups and led by that observer consultant. And then finally, you would debrief with the outside observer to receive that feedback so that you could make plans for improving your teaching based on that feedback. Another option for feedback from students and for anonymous feedback from students, as that small group would be technically anonymous as well because you're not in the room with them as they're giving the feedback. So that would include open-ended feedback forms. These are open throughout the semester. They provide students the opportunity to supply you with instructional and learning feedback at any time. And to make this kind of feedback practice effective, we want to keep a few things in mind. First, we want to craft open-ended questions that encourage a diversity of student responses. That's going to provide us with more fruitful feedback than just maybe a multiple choice or Likert scale questions. So we could include those questions as well, but they're not as useful for a formative kind of feedback like this, where we're looking to improve specific things about our teaching practice. But you could include, a combination of question types. We also want to make sure that questions are simple, clear, and specific. We want to make it as easy as possible for students to understand the kind of feedback that we're asking for, and it'll also ensure the feedback that we receive is useful and actionable. Additionally, before we deploy any feedback method, we want to evaluate why we're asking the questions in the feedback form. What do we hope to learn from our student responses? How can we best gather that feedback? So in other words, what questions do we need to ask to get the kind of feedback that we need to improve our instructional practices? And then finally, it might be a good idea to maybe ask a colleague, or you can, run it by someone in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning to proofread your questions for clarity, for specificity, and for usefulness, and with an eye towards your specific instructional goals. One method of feedback that you've probably heard of that is gaining more and more traction, I think, is the mid-semester feedback survey. Mid-semester feedback allows instructors to check in with students with enough time to tweak teaching prior to the end of the semester. One option that we've already talked about is that small group instructional diagnostic. But another option is to just distribute a mid-semester feedback survey. If you're using original course view in Blackboard, you can use the anonymous survey feature in your Blackboard course. But if you're in Ultra Course View, or you just want a more versatile and customizable survey, for example, one that you can keep using once you do convert to Ultra Course View, you can use Qualtrics through NIU. And that will give you a lot more options to customize that survey, and then you can also deploy it multiple times to different groups and collect your data in that way, so you don't have to duplicate the survey. A mid-semester or midterm feedback survey would typically go out around the midway point of the course, obviously, and that'll be, you know, different times during the semester depending on how long your course runs. Questions you could include on the mid-semester feedback survey could cover a range of topics, and it'll really be dependent on the specific course that you're teaching, and what you hope to get out, what type of feedback you hope to get out of those surveys. But for example, you could ask about your course goals, about inclusive teaching practices, classroom dynamics, the pacing of the course. You know, is it just right? Is it, you know, are you going through things maybe too quickly according to students? Just feel that it's going too slowly. You could ask about the content of the course. You could ask about the learning activities that you're having students do, or any other areas that you think are helpful to assessing how you could improve student achievement by adjusting your teaching practice. Another option is having an observation by a colleague. So in other words, peer observation. Having another instructor sit in on your class period could be a great source of feedback. And as an observer, this colleague can help you understand, you know, the dynamics of your classroom from a different perspective or from another perspective. Peer observation is when, you know, one instructor observes another in order to develop and improve their classroom practice. And that could be, you know, either one. So you could go and observe a colleague's class to improve your own teaching, but you could also have a colleague observe your class to get feedback on your teaching, to improve your teaching. A peer can be any colleague willing to support you. You can even make it a reciprocal arrangement to help each other. So you observe each other's classes, in other words. Your colleague could be from a different department, or it could be from the same department. They could have just recently joined teaching. It could be maybe a member of CITL. We do teaching observations as well. It could be a member of administration who isn't directly involved in your tenure, promotion, or reappointment. Peer observations generally, ideally, a two-way process that can benefit both the observer and the observed. So the goal is improving both teaching and learning. And by observing one of our peers teaching a lesson, the observer builds on their current knowledge and ideas for teaching. And then also by being observed, an instructor gains valuable feedback about their students' learning experience. Peer observation doesn't only increase knowledge of teaching and learning, it can also increase confidence in teaching, or in other words, the instructor's self-efficacy. One way this can manifest is if the observer is inspired maybe to try something new in their own classroom, or to come away from an observation feeling like what they're currently doing is in line with good quality teaching and learning. And maybe, you know, the observer reassures their colleague who they're observing that, you know, what they're doing is in line with good quality teaching and learning. Another influence on teacher confidence and student outcomes is the idea of collective teacher efficacy, which is believing that, you know, together, collectively, instructors can make a positive difference in their students' learning. So peer observation can help develop that belief as instructors work together with the knowledge that, you know, by improving their teaching practice, by doing these peer observations, they can promote more effective student learning and achievement collectively. So peer observation is a great opportunity to observe and reflect on our teaching and learning, on what we've experienced and how we can adapt it to better reach our students and help them toward their learning goals. Also, I just wanted to bring up CITL as well. CITL offers many options for teaching support. As I mentioned already, we do classroom observations, we do one-on-one consultations in a multitude of modalities. So you can email us, or you can, you know, book an appointment with us to talk on the phone, or to meet in person, or to talk online on Zoom or on Teams. We also offer regular workshops on specific topics related to teaching or technical or learning technology like this one, major events like the Teaching Effectiveness Institute, which our registration for Teaching Effectiveness Institute in January is up, and it's on faculty burnout. So definitely be on the lookout for that and sign up if you're interested. Also the Online Teaching Symposium, which is typically held at the end of the fall semester, and so on. So feel free, please do explore our support options on our CITL website and utilize our services to get the feedback and teaching assistance that you need throughout the year in whatever form that takes. So once we have gathered student achievement and feedback data, we need to actually do something with it. Simply gathering that information isn't going to improve outcomes for students or improve students' learning experience. So we need to sort through that data. We need to pull out the constructive criticism. We need to create a plan for what changes we can or need to make, and then we need to actually take action. Another important piece of the puzzle is actually telling our students what actions we're taking based on their feedback. And that's important because it shows our students that we value their feedback and that we're actually taking into account what they have to say about their learning experience. And then that's going to signal to them that, you know, you're taking it seriously, you actually are reading this, and they're more likely to give you feedback at the end of the semester as well. And that's just another opportunity for feedback and learning for yourself, and another source of data for you to improve your teaching practice. It's also a great opportunity to clarify why you've approached teaching and learning in certain ways up until that point, particularly if you are using best practices and you want your students to understand why you aren't going to make certain changes to your teaching practice based on, you know, maybe some feedback that they give you. An example of this might be if you're doing like a flipped classroom where you have students do the reading or watch lecture videos at home, and then they come into the classroom and they actually do something active with that. They apply it. And sometimes students have certain expectations coming into our classes. Maybe they expect to be passive, quote unquote, learners and just sit back and listen to lecture during the class period. And they don't understand why they need to actually, you know, do something in class. And so this might be an opportunity, you know, if they have that expectation and they give you that feedback where they want more lecture and they don't want to have to, you know, apply it, they want to do that stuff outside of the classroom, then that might be an opportunity for you to clarify why you do what you do in your teaching practices. So it's just a way to get student feedback, to get that information about your students and what their expectations are for their learning, so that you can either make changes that you think are appropriate or explain your decision making around why you have certain approaches. Rather than just one cycle of instructional improvement, feedback and achievement should actually inform our instructional improvements continually throughout the semester. So ideally, we would adopt a systematic process for collecting and using data at multiple points in the semester. And that might just be, you know, depending on your workload, your teaching load, you know, your other responsibilities as faculty. That might be at the middle of the semester and at the end of the semester, but we could also look at, you know, multiple times throughout the semester, broadening that, expanding that to include more feedback points. And that can be formal feedback, or that can just be, you know, picking a point in the semester to look at the data that we have already collected on students' achievement in our gradebook, for example. So when we're collecting achievement data about students, we need to interpret that data. We need to develop hypotheses about which factors might be contributing to students' academic performance. And then we need to determine what specific actions we can take to better meet students' learning needs. And then we would implement those changes to our instructional practices. So in other words, we test our hypotheses. And then we'd restart the process of collecting and interpreting new student achievement data to, again, evaluate our instructional practices. So since this process is cyclical, you could actually begin at any point in the process. So you could start with the hypothesis instead of starting with data collection first, and then follow through to testing out your instructional improvement, and then lead into the next cycle of collecting data and so on. But we do want to have multiple points throughout the semester where we're collecting this data, collecting feedback from students or from an outside observer, and then looking at student achievement data as well, and then using that to inform how we progress. So one final resource that I'll go over for collecting data to improve teaching would be using self-reflection, for instance, a teaching journal. A teaching journal, or just any type of self-reflection, can be a useful tool to help us reflect on our teaching. It can assist us as we work to develop our own personal teaching style and refine that. So a few ways that we could use a teaching journal to improve our teaching might be, first, as we plan our instruction. We can write the goals of a class session, how we plan to reach those goals, and if we articulate what we want students to be able to do after a particular class session or because of a particular class session, that can help us design more effective and relevant learning experiences for our students, because we're less likely to include, busy work if we know this is what I want my students to do and this is what we need to do in order to get them to that point. Another way we could use the teaching journal to improve teaching is by writing immediately after a class session. So we could reflect on whether we've reached the goals that we set out to accomplish, what worked for us, what didn't work as well as we would have liked, what alternative things we could try next time. And you don't have to change things constantly, especially if you've taught multiple sections of the same course in a semester. Something might go well in one class section, and the exact same thing might not go well in another, because those groups of students are different. So this process might actually mean doing things differently for different sets of students too, and figuring out what works for each set of students. We could also, in our teaching journal, write down anything that we've learned about teaching, or any ideas that we run across. So for example, we could write about observations about a particular student, or a combination of students in small groups that worked really well, or something that we learned about ourselves as learning facilitators, or we could record ideas about teaching that we gain from talking to colleagues, or from professional development sessions that we attend, or by attending workshops on teaching, or by attending conferences, and then directly relating all of these ideas that we encountered to our own teaching. And doing that direct connection work can help us become more effective teachers. So we want to not just write down the things that, the new ideas. We want to say, how can this apply to my teaching, to my subject? And how does it maybe apply to what you're already doing, or how does it connect to what you're already doing? So I'm going to send you a few helpful resources, just a few, in a follow-up email today. But I wanted to leave enough time for any specific questions that you have about using student achievement and feedback to improve your teaching. So if there were any specific questions that anyone had that I haven't answered yet, or any specific resources that you'd like me to send along and find for you after the fact, then please let me know. So you can either come on the mic, or you can post in the chat if you have anything.
Hi there, Amanda. Thank you for the presentation.
Thanks, Chris.
You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I was curious about like this small group session that you said that the CTL could also help us set up. I was just curious, like, how long does that last, and what is maybe the process like, have something like that set up?
Yeah, so you just contact us. I would contact Stephanie Richter to get some more information about that. I haven't conducted one of them myself, but I know that is a service that we do offer, that we've offered pre-pandemic, and now we're getting back into that. I can speak to, it might be similar to our course observation process, which I am in the process of doing, where you meet the semester beforehand, or even earlier in the semester, and talk about, what your goals are, and what the plan is for the observation, and then set up when the observations are. So I'm assuming it would be kind of similar for that small group session as well, where you talk. We would meet with you first to talk about it, and what your goals are, and then we would set up the days when we would come and conduct those feedback sessions.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda.
No problem. And I can find more information on that for you as well, and send that in my follow-up email.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? All right, well, I will stick around if you have any questions. But thanks everyone for attending today and discussing using student achievement and feedback to improve your teaching. I hope you have a great rest of your semester. And if you have any other questions, then please do stick around, and I will stay around if you have specific questions.